Hey, what's up guys, it's Bakes here and thank you for joining me for my favourite video that I get to do at the end of the year. Now that we've moved into 2024 and can take a look back at the year prior, I can put together my top 10 list of my favourite horror movies from 2023. Now as usual, before I get into the actual top 10 list itself, I'm just going to do a quick recap and a quick overview, summing up my complete thoughts of the year 2023 and the horror movies that we got. So I know I said this a few times in videos that I recorded through the year, but I feel like the standard for 2023 horror movies was a little bit weak. I felt like it was a little bit lacking. Don't get me wrong, I don't think it was a complete trash year or a complete dud of a year. There was still plenty of horror movies that I really enjoyed, but overall, in comparison to some recent really strong years, I just thought 2023 was a bit meh. Which might be an unpopular opinion because I've actually heard a lot of people say that 2023 was a really strong year for horror movies and they really enjoyed it, but, sort of each to their own. For me, it was a little bit lacking. It kind of grew on me during the home run stretch, and what I mean by that is before putting this list together, going back and rewatching some horror movies from earlier on in the year that I was just wanting to see again and see if my opinions changed, and also going back and checking out some horror movies that I missed and I heard a lot of people talking about. So I found some hidden gems when I went and did that home run stretch, and I found a new love for some movies that I just thought were kind of okay. So my opinions changed a little bit compared to what they would have been, if you asked me 2-3 months ago, but still overall I feel like 2023 was a little bit lacking. And the best example I can use is like my number one horror movie that I have for this list, 2023, probably wouldn't have made the top 3 or maybe even top 5 for last year, and I thought 2022 was a really strong year for horror movies, and sort of in comparison, as I said, 2022 really strong, 2023 just kind of meh. But don't get me wrong, as I said, there was still plenty of horror movies that I really enjoyed from 2023. I'm really happy with how my list has turned out. You know that your list ain't that bad when you had to make some tough cuts for your number 10 spot. Like, there were a few movies that I really wanted to put as my number 10, but, as I said, it's a top 10 list for a reason. You have to make those tough cuts. I feel like that's what's kind of fun about doing a top 10 list anyway. But to sum it up, I watched a total of 49 new horror movies from 2023, which is a little bit less than usual, or at least less than what I watched last year. I started this year by watching Megan. That was the first horror movie that I watched in 2023, or Megan for those Americans, and I finished the year watching Godzilla Minus One. Both of them I watched in cinemas too, so came full circle there. Now, as usual with this list, they're not going to be full-length reviews. I'm just going to talk about a few positives, a few reasons why it made my top 10 list, go through the plots a little bit. And again, guys, this list is my top 10. So this isn't, a definitive top 10. I'm not telling you what are the best 10 horror movies from 2023. But feel free to let me know your top 10s in the comments below, guys. As I said, there's no wrong answers. It's all subjective, each to their own. And without delaying any longer, let's get into this top 10 list of my favourite horror movies from 2023. Starting off my list and coming in at my number 10 is Evil Dead Rise. Now, to quickly go through the plot for those who don't know, in this movie we follow a family living in this apartment complex where an earthquake has just happened. The son finds a copy of the Necronomicon in the basement, and of course all hell breaks loose. The mum ends up getting possessed, and now with 3 kids and her sister have to fight for survival. I, like a lot of people, was really nervous about this movie because it could have been a disaster. A new Evil Dead film coming out after the franchise has been sidelined for 10 years, at least in movie form, set in an apartment complex with child leads. Don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with child leads. I was just worried that the movie would lack balls and kind of play it safe because we don't want to hurt kids. But I had my fingers crossed that this movie would at least be fun, and yeah, it was. With all that being said, I'm just going to quickly say I do think this movie was a little bit overrated. And don't get it twisted, guys, there's a difference between being overrated and bad. I don't think this movie was bad at all. As I said, I just thought a lot of people fucking sucked it off. I don't think it's as great as a lot of people made it out to be, but of course, it still made my top 10, so I liked it a lot. But I thought this movie had a lot of things that I really liked. I thought the family was fun. The setting was fun. The gore was fun. The gore is always fun in Evil Dead movies. Again, I don't think this movie was perfect. I think there were small issues sort of sprinkled throughout this movie. But it had good pace. It had a nice runtime. Definitely rewatchable. This movie was really close to being cut. It was between three movies, making my number 10 spot, and I gave this one a rewatch because it's the one that I had seen the least recently, and it held on, and it was enjoyable enough, so that's why it's going to be my number 10. I actually have a full-length review coming out soon, but for now, I'm going to give Evil Dead Rise a 7.5 out of 10. Coming in at my number 9 is the movie Beau is Afraid, which is going to be a really hard movie to explain the plot for because just in general it's a really weird movie, but here we go. In this movie we follow Beau, who is a man who is extremely paranoid about everything, and to be fair, he probably has the right to be paranoid because everything bad that could happen just happens to him. And now in this movie he has to travel cross country to go and see his mum, and we follow him through these events. This film was extremely divided with people. Just based off the average response by audiences, it would probably make it director Ari Aster's least successful film. Obviously directed by Ari Aster, who is the director who gave us Midsommar and Hereditary, and this would be his most unique movie for sure. And I really hesitated actually putting it on my list because I wasn't sure if it was even horror enough, but friends that I trust in the horror circle that I come from put it on their list, so I thought, fuck it, why not? Because it's sort of hard to explain the genre of this movie. It definitely has horror moments, but it's also a comedy and a drama and sort of just a mindfuck in general. But either way, moving on. Like I said, this movie definitely isn't for the average moviegoer. Lots of people didn't like it, and I can see why. I can perfectly understand why. Really long. This movie's like 3 hours long or something. Very weird. The tone of this movie is just very inconsistent as well. As I said, it's jumping from comedic moments to intense moments to scary moments to sad moments. Like, it's all over the place. And I wasn't a huge fan of moments during the middle part of this movie, especially the trippy stage show part where it turns into like this make-believe land thing. That was probably my least favorite part of the movie, and it just seemed to go on and on. But the rest of it I really enjoyed, especially the first 20 to 25 minutes of this movie. It was so fucking funny, so weird, so stressful. Like, everything that could go wrong went wrong to Beau, and it was equally stressful and funny at the same time. I loved it. I also really liked the ending where Beau finally gets to the house, and I thought everything there was awesome, and yes, I mean everything, including the thing in the attic, and, you know, other little moments sprinkled through. As I said, I enjoyed this movie. I can perfectly understand why other people wouldn't. But with that being said, I've had no big urge to actually go back and rewatch this movie. Again, probably just because it's a 3 hour long movie. It is kind of slow. The vibes is very weird, you know, as I said, it's tonally changing all over the place and everything, so it's hard to just sit there and go, yes, I'm going to watch Beau is Afraid, but I did enjoy it, so I'm going to give Beau is Afraid an 8 out of 10. Now, the movie that I have here for my number 8 spot makes me a little bit nervous because people are going to hear it and think, what the fuck, because this was one of the most hated horror movies of the year. But guys, please just hear me out and stick around for my video, I'm begging you. My number 8 is Exorcist Believer. Now, the elephant in the room, for those who don't know, this was one of the most hated horror movies of the year. And in a way, I can actually see why, but at the end of the day, each to their own, I liked it. So to go through the plot for this one, we follow a single dad raising his daughter. One day she's walking home from school with a friend, and they go walkabouts off into the woods. They go missing for 3 to 4 days. They end up showing up again, but it turns out something maybe a little bit paranormal happened to them while they were off in the woods. But I went into this movie with zero expectations. I was neither leaning into thinking it was going to be a bad movie or a good movie. I just simply watched it. I also saw it on opening day, first thing in the morning, so I hadn't heard anyone else's opinions or reviews. As I said, I just sit and watched. And even though, honestly, this movie didn't blow me away at all, like I wasn't floored or anything, I thought it was entertaining. Like, the whole time I was watching it, I wasn't thinking, like, maybe there's something else I could be doing. I had my full attention on the screen, and that's sort of what you want from a movie, just to be entertained, and that's what I was, being entertained. There were lots of little things that I did like about this movie, but the main thing that stuck out to me was the father-daughter dynamic and that whole story point, you know, him not really believing, but just doing anything to make his daughter better. That's what I really enjoyed. I actually thought it was quite emotional. Definitely my favourite part of the story. And this is going to sound a little bit harsh, but the legacy stuff and the things that called back to the OG movie that pissed lots of people off didn't really bother me. Now, don't get me wrong, I still think it could have been handled a little bit better, but it didn't irk me as much. I don't know why. Originally, this movie was actually higher on this list, and I didn't crumble because I knew people were going to be like, what the fuck, I don't cave into peer pressure that easily. But as I said, nothing about it really floored me, but I was entertained. I did like this movie, and I thought it was a solid watch. I wouldn't hesitate to watch it again. So Exorcist Believer for me is also coming in as an 8 out of 10, and it comes in at my number 8 spot. So my number 7 is a movie that I would consider a hidden gem. It's a film I don't think a lot of people saw, and I almost passed up on it myself, but I ended up checking it out, and I thought it was great. So my number 7 goes to a movie called Candyland. In this movie, we follow a bunch of prostitutes. I don't know if they go by another term. I guess in this movie they have the nickname lot lizards and whatever, but they live and work at this truck stop / motel, and we pretty much follow their day-to-day lives. Some interesting characters come in and out, and they mingle and interact amongst themselves, but as I said, we're pretty much following their day-to-day routines, but then some murders start to happen, and then the story goes on from there. As I said, would consider this one a hidden gem. It was a real treasure to come across. As I said, I don't think a lot of people checked it out. As I said also, I almost passed on it. I didn't read any descriptions. I went into it completely blind. Just based off the poster, I thought it was like a cheap, low-budget, cheesy slasher, but it's completely different. Again, a guy I trust in a horror community that I'm sort of a part of. I'll give his channel a shout-out, Double Shots J on YouTube. He was hyping it up, and then I eventually checked it out, and yeah, it was awesome. I really liked the detailed, gritty, realistic world of truck stop prostitution that I was taken into. It sounds weird, but I really did think it was quite interesting. The ensemble cast and characters in this movie I thought was fucking awesome. Probably my favourite ensemble cast just off the top of my head. One of the Baldwin brothers was in this movie. I don't remember what his first name was, but the whole time I was looking at his face, I'm like, that fucking looks like a Baldwin. And I looked it up on Letterboxd, and he was. One of the most underrated performances of the year, Owen Campbell. He was probably my favourite male performance of the year. If you don't know Owen Campbell, he was in X, and he was also in Super Dark Times. He was great in this movie. For some people, the flow might be a little bit too slow for them. It is a little bit of a slow burn in parts, but the end result of the movie was definitely worth sitting through, in my opinion. Any film that closes with Don't Dream It's Over by Crowded House is all good in my books. So again, this one is going to be an 8 out of 10, and as I said, Candyland coming in as my number 7. Coming in at my number 6 is director Eli Roth's holiday slasher film titled Thanksgiving. The plot for this one is a group of teens unintentionally cause a riot at a Black Friday sale, which ends in tragedy after a handful of people are killed. Now, 1 year later, on Thanksgiving, someone by the name of John Carver, who is dressed as a pilgrim, starts to seek revenge on this group of teenagers and also a handful of other people who were involved, and starts picking them off one by one. Eli Roth is a fairly split director. I do like him. He's not one of my all-time favorites or anything, but he's done a handful of really cool movies. The reason why I bring him up is I feel like he is a director that gets a little bit too much hate, but I feel like he really knew exactly what he was doing with this movie and did a really good job of it. I kind of went into this one just expecting a fun, easygoing slasher film, and that's exactly what it delivered. This movie was a blast. I thought it was a lot of fun. Extremely simple, it wasn't trying to reinvent the wheel of what a slasher movie is. It just did a really good slasher movie. If you haven't seen this movie, it pretty much is Scream, but set on Thanksgiving. It's got the whole who is the killer behind the mask angle, taking out a group of teens. As I said, very similar to Scream. But it's got a more comedic approach as well. There was lots I liked about this movie. I thought the kills were really cool. I liked John Carver as the slasher himself. But the thing that I liked most about this movie was actually the ending. And not in the way of like it blew me away with some crazy twist or anything like that, or the third act was, super spectacular. What I really liked about the ending was more so what it stands for. The ending and what happens to the killer really gave me instant franchise vibes. Without spoiling anything of like whether the killer is dead or survives the ending of this movie, I can see it working, if the killer survived. As I said, I'm not trying to spoil anything here, but if he survived, you can do the whole serial killer, active in the wild, where will he pop up next? Or if he died, you can just keep him coming back, Jason Voorhees style. This is the most hyped I've been in a long time for a potential franchise, probably since Terrifier, honestly. But besides that, I had a blast. As I said, I thought it was really fucking funny as well. As I said, it had more comedic moments through it than what I compared it with Scream. It was a lot of fun, easy to watch, and it's going to be super rewatchable for Thanksgiving, even though here in Australia we don't celebrate that holiday, but fuck it, I can celebrate it in movie form. So for Thanksgiving, I'm going to give it an 8 out of 10. And an easy transition from my number 6 to my number 5, since I briefly brought it up before, but my number 5 is Scream 6. Before I get into talking about Scream 6, I just want to quickly say I don't want to get too much into the politics of Scream 7. Obviously, it really sucks with what happened with Melissa Barrera and Spyglass cutting her from Scream 7 for a completely fucking dumb reason. I really feel like Spyglass are regretting their decision and now chasing their tails trying to clean it up, but I feel like the damage is already done. A lot of people are calling for a boycott of Scream 7, which is perfectly fine because it's a perfectly valid reason. But in my opinion, I think they'll just scrap Scream 7 altogether. If they don't, you can just imagine that they'll postpone the movie for a handful of years, and hopefully for them, they've got their fingers crossed that the dust settles and they can just try and make do with what they have. But really dumb decision by Spyglass. But as I said, not talking about Scream 7, gonna focus on Scream 6. So the plot for this one: the core four, the four surviving members from the events of Scream 5, moved to New York to get away from things, but a new Ghostface killer is now stalking them in the Big Apple. I was someone who was actually underwhelmed with Scream 5. I know a lot of people really liked that movie. I thought it was just average at best. It wasn't bad, it was just, as I said, nothing that really thrilled me. But I was still really stoked for this movie. Changing up the setting was a nice change of pace. Like every slasher franchise, it gets to a point where they go somewhere else. Jason went to Manhattan, Leprechaun went to Vegas, Ghostface in New York. So not an issue for me, fully on board with it. For the first 15-20 minutes of this movie, besides the opening sequence, because I think every opening sequence in Scream is really fucking awesome. Again, besides Scream 5, I thought the opening sequence in Scream 5 was complete bullshit. But besides the opening sequence, I thought the first 15-20 minutes of this movie was a little bit weak, a little bit poor. It took me a little while to get into it. But then as the movie went on and the city started to be explored and Ghostface got introduced and he started to have some scenes, and his kills were like surprisingly really good in this movie. Like there was some like really intense kills that I was like, oh fuck, like it actually took me back a little bit. But it got to a point where I started like sort of swallowing my hate for the first 15-20 minutes, and I was like, fuck, like I'm actually having a pretty fun time. Even the ending, which a lot of people thought was the weakest part of this movie, I didn't mind. Yes, it was a little bit dumb, and again, I feel like it could have been cleaned up a little bit, but I feel like it kind of added to the charm of it being a franchise sequel and far down the track. Though I'm still standing by, one of the members of the core four should have died in this movie. Like, I think it's just, it gets to the point where it's a bit ridiculous. It's like, fuck, all four of you can't just keep surviving, especially when certain things happen to certain characters, and it's like, how the fuck did you live through that? But overall, still had a really fun time with Scream 6, and I'm also going to give this one an 8 out of 10. Coming in at my number 4 is the movie Renfield. This is a movie I feel like most people had forgotten about, or if they hadn't forgotten about it, they just don't want to talk about this movie. The little bits that I have heard people talk about, they just sort of say it was decent at best. But I had a great time with this movie. If you're unfamiliar with Renfield, it's a horror comedy. We obviously follow Renfield, who is played by Nicholas Hoult, who is the servant of Dracula, played by Nicolas Cage. Both of them do a great performance in this movie, but either way, it's in modern times. Renfield has moved Dracula to New Orleans, and this is where he's going to start doing more of his servant work and, getting Dracula back to his healthiest and best. But he decides that he's sick of being under the thumb of Dracula and wants to break away from this manipulative relationship, and that's pretty much our story from there. This movie has no slow or boring parts to me. It is just constantly entertaining, and it does sometimes get a little bit goofy or maybe a little bit ridiculous. But to me, it just sort of went with the fun. It was the definition of a popcorn flick, in my opinion. Great performances, literally all round. A lot of people will highlight Cage as Dracula, but I thought Holt was also really incredible as the title character Renfield. But then, as I said, there's an all-round cast. You know, we have Awkwafina in this movie, who is an actress who is sort of getting a little bit of hate recently, but I thought she did a great job. Ben Schwartz as well. This is not how I pictured a movie about Renfield going. If you're unfamiliar, Renfield is a character in the Dracula universe, and he's been in many films with Dracula as well. If someone said to me, there's a Renfield movie coming out, I wouldn't have pictured an action comedy, but I still had so much fucking fun with this movie. This is one of the only couple that I have rewatched through the year, and rewatching it the second time round, I actually enjoyed it even more than I liked it the first time. The first time I would have originally given it a 7.5 after seeing it in cinemas, but I'm going to give it like an 8.5. I had a great time with this movie. I've also filmed a full-length review of Renfield, but I didn't want to put it up before my top 10 list, so I'll sit on it for a little while. But as I said, Renfield, I'm going to give it an 8.5. Coming in at my number 3 is The Last Voyage of the Demeter. This movie's about a crew working on a boat called the Demeter, where they're transporting some personal items of a mysterious count across the ocean. Spoiler alert, the mysterious count is Count Dracula, so obviously once the boat hits the ocean, havoc starts to ensue. Again, like my previously mentioned Renfield, this is a story very tied in with Dracula. From the original novel to a few of the film adaptations, this has always been a scene. Dracula's stuff is being transported to a different country. Dracula is secretly on board of the boat, so when the boat arrives, all of the crew are mysteriously dead. And this movie is pretty much just filling in the blanks of what happened on that boat. To me, this was the biggest surprise of the year. Like, I was so prepared to pass on this movie when it first came out. From everything that I saw of the posters and trailers, it just looked like a cheesy Dracula on a boat movie, and I was just like, yeah, I'll eventually see it, but, I don't need to see it right away. The only reason I checked it out was because I had time to kill and nothing better to do, so I'm like, I might as well go watch that Dracula on a boat movie. And maybe it's because my expectations were so low. This movie literally floored me. Like, I thought it was so fucking awesome. It constantly had my jaw on the floor. Creepy atmosphere. It really felt cold, wet, with the rainy nights on the boat. But then add in Dracula himself, which I liked as something different. A lot of people were confused, going like, is this really Dracula? Because in this movie, he sort of has this man-bat hybrid look to him, which Dracula has always sort of been, that he's a vampire, but no, he literally looks like a bat creature in this movie. He has more like primal tendencies, animal thoughts of nature sort of thing going about him, which, as I said, I liked as something different, but I will say at times it felt a little bit weird because it was like this Batman creature feature thing, but then some points he was Dracula and had more human tendencies, which was sort of a little bit jarring, but either way, I still really liked Dracula in this movie. Something I haven't heard many people bring up is how dark this movie is. Like, there was tons of moments where it went places I didn't expect it to go, and like sort of gave me chills, and I applaud it for that. There were so many like depressing moments and fucked up moments, and as I said, I feel like not enough people checked out this movie to know how dark it actually was. There was lots of moments that really genuinely left me floored in this one. And it didn't feel as long as what the runtime for this movie actually is. I think it's like 2.5 hours. I had no sweat, sitting through this movie. I had a great time. As I said, maybe it's because my expectations were so low, but this movie was something that really surprised me. So my number 3 is The Last Voyage of the Demeter, and I'm also going to give it an 8.5 out of 10. Coming in at my number 2 is the movie that I said in the introduction was the last film that I watched in 2023 before putting my list together. So my number 2 is Godzilla Minus One. And I actually have a little bit of a story about watching this movie as the last film for 2023 before doing my list. As I said in my introduction, I was doing a home run stretch, going back and watching movies that I missed from earlier on in the year. And to do that, I put a little list together of movies that I felt like I needed to watch. And as I also said in the introduction, 2023 horror movies I feel like was kind of lacking. I wasn't overly impressed with what we got. So the list of movies that I had by the end actually wasn't that big, and still a handful of them I still haven't watched. But there was one that stuck out to me because I heard such great things about it, and that was Godzilla Minus One. So I said to myself, as long as I see Godzilla Minus One, I'm going to be happy. I tried to find a version to watch online. I couldn't find a good, clean version of it. So I got on Google, searched if there was any cinemas near me that were playing it. There was one that was a 35-minute drive away. It was a cinema I've never been to before. I went and watched it, and as soon as the movie was over, I looked at the rest of my list and I went, you know what? I'm perfectly content with what I've seen. I sort of had a sneaking suspicion that Godzilla Minus One was going to be a top 10 contender. The other ones weren't really giving me that vibe, so I said, you know what? My list is ready to go. And as I said, Godzilla Minus One is my number 2. For a lot of people, this probably would have been the most surprising horror movie of the year, due to the fact of how the American Godzilla / Monsterverse movies normally play out. They've got more of an action, blockbuster sort of feel about them. But I've always felt like Japan really care about their native monster and making him, a legitimate threat in like these really meaningful movies. I actually heard that the last adaptation of Godzilla that they did, I believe it's called Shin Godzilla from 2016, was also pretty good. I haven't seen that movie, but as I said, I heard that was pretty solid, so I had my fingers crossed that Godzilla Minus One was going to be good, and then I started to hear other people say it was good, so as I said, it was the last movie that I sort of suspected were going to be in top 10 contention. This movie did the seemingly impossible. Made me care about the human storyline. I've done reviews of a handful of Godzilla movies on my channel. I've seen majority of the Godzilla films as well, and all of them have a very similar issue. The human storylines I don't give a fuck about, and they eat up too much of the movie's runtime. Not only did they make me care about the human storyline, it was just really fucking good. Like, in the emotions, like, I genuinely cared about the human characters and didn't want them getting hurt. Along with that, they gave us the truly scariest version of Godzilla I've ever seen. Now, kaiju monsters and creature features in general don't normally creep me out. Godzilla was genuinely terrifying in this movie. He was the perfect representation of what Godzilla is meant to be, just destructive force of nature that just seems like there is no clean way to get out, unscathed by Godzilla. This was the first time in ages where there was moments where I didn't want him destroying cities. Like, I was like, go play in the ocean, that's fine. Just don't touch these characters, don't touch these cities. And man, this movie hit with the emotions as well. Like, there was a few times I teared up, I'm going to be completely honest. I loved the period piece and having it take place during the war. Moments with our lead and his work crew on the boats reminded me of Jaws, especially that first attack when Godzilla first comes across these four on the boat. Gave me very much Jaws vibes, and I loved that. There was so much that I liked about this movie. I'm sure a lot of people saw it. I've sort of rambled on this installment, so I'm going to give Godzilla Minus One an 8.5 out of 10. Really, really close to a 9 though, so opinions might change over time, but for now an 8.5 for Godzilla Minus One. And coming in as my number 1, my favourite horror movie of 2023, here I have the film Talk to Me. Now, each year has its horror movie, as in the horror movie of the year that everyone's talking about before and after its release, and everyone's saying, oh, you need to go and see it. And for me, in my opinion, this was the horror movie of the year. As I said, people were constantly talking about it. Everybody seemed to at least enjoy it somewhat. It was quite popular, so it might not be too big of a shock that it's my number 1, but I genuinely really enjoyed this movie. For those who haven't seen this movie, the plot follows Mia, our main character, who is grieving the death of her mum, and she's trying to find an outlet to dealing with it, and she comes into contact with this friendship group that she vaguely knows, where they do this thing where they have this embalmed, plastered hand thing, where you grab it and say a few things, and it allows you to talk to the dead via being possessed. They kind of treat it like a drug, they're all getting high off it and having a good time, but as you would come to expect, it ends up going too far and causes some major consequences, so I'll leave the plot there for that one. First of all, as an Aussie, I really enjoyed the realistic representation of Australian youth. as in when all not going off and playing with possessed hands and talking to the dead. At least I don't know anyone that does that, but I just really like the interaction and the culture. It just felt very relatable and genuine. They did a really good job at capturing that. Sometimes when, you know, you're portraying youth, it's what the studio thinks, that's how kids interact, but this one just felt genuine and real. Great performances all round by a really young and talented cast. They all did a great job. Great themes and a great story. Great scares. This movie was pretty creepy as well. One of, if not my favourite scenes of the whole year was in this movie, and I'm talking about the montage scene. It was equally terrifying and fun, and just really interesting with how they put the music in there as well. I thought it was great. And then it's followed by another one of my favourite scenes of the year, the scene with the brother, and I won't go into too much detail there because it's a pretty major part of the movie. Pretty full on, pretty disturbing, but also equally entertaining. I'm also really proud of Danny and Michael Philippou, who were the directors of this movie, and it's not me being biased because they're Australian and I'm Australian or anything, but also kind of is because I'm really proud of them. You know, they started off on YouTube. Their YouTube channel was Raka Raka, and I'm probably saying like was, but it probably is still up. You know, they made really great content, and I remember watching their videos, and all of their videos were really cool, and they put a lot of time and energy into it, and you could tell. And I stopped watching their videos for a little while. I feel like they kind of went quiet. I presume they were busy making this movie. But I feel like they did a great job, and I think it's just really cool to see where they came from, and just knowing it was YouTube and content creating, and now they've made a really cool horror movie, and as I said, my favourite of the year. To me, they had clear influences. They constantly spoke about in interviews how Ari Aster was one of their influences, and especially Hereditary in particular. You can definitely see a lot of influence from that film, and that movie was great as well. This was one of the scarier horror movies of the year. I wouldn't say it was the scariest, but a lot of moments that made me feel pretty creepy, and a few moments of disturbing imagery, and very emotional too. You know, as I said, we have Mia who's grieving the death of her mum, and then with the events unraveling in this film, it doesn't make it any easier for any of the characters. So leaving my little rant of Talk to Me there, I'm going to give Talk to Me a 9 out of 10. As I said, really enjoyed this movie. I thought it was great. I know a lot of people also really liked it. So again, my number one is Talk to Me, and I give it a 9 out of 10. So there we go, guys, through my top 10 list of my favourite horror movies from 2023. Again, this was my list, so my personal favourites and movies that stuck out to me. But feel free to drop your top 10 in the comments below, or even if you don't want to do a top 10, just a few of your favourites, or even if they weren't some of your high-ups in the year, just movies that you feel like maybe I missed out on and would like to recommend, feel free to drop them in the comments below. Or if you have any opinions on any of the movies that I had in my top 10, feel free to let me know in the comments below, guys. But as usual, I'll do a quick little recap before we wrap up this video. So my number 10 was Evil Dead Rise with a 7.5. My number 9 was Beau is Afraid with an 8 out of 10. My number 8 is where I lost all credit for future opinions and reviews, and hopefully everyone's still watching my video now, but I had Exorcist Believer with an 8 out of 10. My number 7 was Candyland, again an 8 out of 10. My number 6 was Thanksgiving, an 8 out of 10. My number 5 was Scream 6 with an 8 out of 10. Number 4 was Renfield with an 8.5. Number 3 was the most surprising horror movie of the year in my opinion, The Last Voyage of the Demeter with an 8.5. Number 2 was Godzilla Minus One with an 8.5 out of 10, was really close to a 9. And my number 1 was Talk to Me with a 9 out of 10. So again, if you have any comments on any of those movies I had in my top 10, feel free to let me know in the comments below. And again, guys, feel free to drop your top 10 list. I'd love to see your lists and see how they differ, and if there was any movies that I should have ended up checking out that I passed on. But yeah, thank you for joining me for this top 10 video, guys. This is my favorite video that I get to do at the end of the year. I can't wait to start putting together my list already of 2024. I've seen one movie so far, Night Swim, and that was fucking terrible. That movie was so bad. But yeah, I still am really looking forward to putting together my 2024 list. Let me know some of your most anticipated movies maybe of 2024, and I'll see you for another video soon, guys. Peace.